Sections. The sun hung low over the western edge of the valley, casting long shadows across the dry scrubland that stretched from the ridgeline down to the creek bed. The light was the color of old copper, and the air smelled of dust and sage and the faint promise of rain that never seemed to come. The ranch house sat in a shallow depression between two low hills, a weathered structure of rough-hewn timber and stone that looked like it had grown out of the earth rather than been built upon it. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, dissipating into the evening sky. Prior Quorum Thomas Brennan stood at the fence line, one boot propped on the lower rail, his eyes scanning the herd scattered across the near pasture. He was a broad man, weathered by 38 years of hard living, and with hands that bore the scars of barbed wire and rope burn and 1,000 small injuries that came with working the land. His face was lined and sun-darkened, his jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. He wore the same clothes he wore every day: canvas trousers, a faded work shirt, a leather vest that had belonged to his father. His hat was stained with sweat and dust, the brim curled from years of use. The cattle were settling for the night, their dark shapes moving slowly through the yellowing grass. He counted them without thinking, a habit so ingrained he could do it in his sleep. 43 head, down from 52 last spring. The drought had taken its toll, and he'd sold off what he couldn't feed through the summer. The remaining animals were lean but healthy, and that was all a man could ask for in a year like this. Sections. He turned back toward the house, walking the worn path between the fence and the porch. The ranch stretched out around him in all directions, 200 acres of hard country that demanded everything a man had to give, and returned just enough to keep him breathing. His father had broken this land, and his father before that, and now it was his. He worked it alone, from dawn until the light failed, and then he worked some more by lamplight, mending tack and sharpening tools and keeping the machinery running. Sections. The house was dark when he climbed the porch steps. He scraped his boots on the edge of the top step and pushed through the door into the main room. The air inside was still and close, smelling of wood smoke and leather, and the faint mustiness of a place that held no life beyond one man's survival. He struck a match and lit the lamp on the table, and the warm glow pushed back the shadows just enough to see by. Sections. The kitchen occupied one corner of the main room, a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, a few shelves holding tin plates and cups, and a handful of mismatched utensils. He moved to the stove and opened the firebox, stirring the coals and adding kindling until small flames licked up around the wood. He filled a pot with water from the bucket by the door and set it on the stovetop to heat. Prarv dinner was what it always was. Beans from a tin, heated until they bubbled. A piece of hardtack soaked in the bean water until it was soft enough to chew. Coffee so strong it could strip paint, brewed in a battered pot that hadn't been properly cleaned in months. He ate standing at the counter, spooning the food directly from the pot, washing it down with scalding coffee that burned his tongue. Sections. The silence in the house was absolute. No voice, no footsteps, no sound of another living soul, just the crackle of the fire and the scrape of his spoon against tin, and the slow tick of the mantel clock that had stopped working 2 years ago, but still sat on the shelf because he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. Pot over. He finished eating and set the pot in the dry sink without washing it. He'd deal with it in the morning, or the morning after that. He poured another cup of coffee and carried it to the chair by the window, lowering himself into the seat with a grunt. His back ached from a full day of fence repair, and his hands were stiff from gripping wire cutters and post diggers. Sections. Through the window, he could see the last light fading from the sky, up with the stars beginning to emerge in the deepening blue. Somewhere out in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered from the far ridge. The sound was lonely and wild, and it suited the night. For he sat there until the coffee went cold in his cup, staring out at nothing, thinking about nothing. This was his life. This was all it had been for 3 years, since the fever took Mary and the baby both in the space of a week. The graves were on the hill behind the house, marked with simple wooden crosses he'd carved himself. He visited them every Sunday, standing in silence because there were no words that meant anything anymore. But the next morning, he rode into town with the sun barely clearing the horizon. The trip took 2 hours on horseback, following the wagon road that wound through the hills and crossed the creek at the shallow ford. He needed supplies, flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, and he needed to post a notice at the general store. Sections. The town of Redemption Flats was a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single wide street. The general store, the saloon, the church, the blacksmith, the livery. A few houses scattered on the outskirts. The population hovered around 200 souls, most of them ranchers and farmers and the people who served them. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and strangers were noted and discussed and generally distrusted. Sections Thomas tied his horse at the rail in front of the general store and climbed the steps to the boardwalk. The store was dim and cluttered, smelling of coffee and tobacco and the sweet scent of dried apples in barrels. Henry Caldwell stood behind the counter, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and a perpetual expression of mild concern. "Sections need supplies," Thomas said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket and sliding it across the counter. "And I need to post this." Sections. Henry picked up the paper and unfolded it, reading the hand-printed words. "Cook wanted. Room and board. Wages negotiable. Apply at Brennan Ranch." He looked up over his spectacles. "You finally giving up on cooking for yourself?" "Par 4. "Never could cook worth a damn," Thomas said. "Figure it's time to admit it." Par. Henry pinned the notice to the board by the door, among the other advertisements for work and livestock and land for sale. "I'll spread the word," he said, "though I don't know who you'll find willing to ride out that far for cooking work." Paper 4. Thomas shrugged. "Someone will need the work." Par. He collected his supplies and loaded them into his saddlebags, then rode back to the ranch, not expecting anything to come of the notice. But 3 days later, just after noon, a wagon appeared on the road from town. Before Thomas was working in the barn, replacing a broken hinge on one of the stall doors, when he heard the rattle of wheels and the creak of wood. He set down his tools and walked out into the sunlight, shading his eyes against the glare. Forward of the wagon was driven by Henry Caldwell, and beside him on the bench sat a woman Thomas had never seen before. She was small and dark-haired, wearing a simple dress of faded blue fabric and a shawl draped over her shoulders, despite the heat. Her skin was brown, her features delicate, her eyes large and very dark. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Sections. Henry pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, dusting off his trousers. "Thomas," he called. "Got someone here about the cooking position." Sections. Thomas walked toward the wagon, his eyes on the woman. She didn't look at him, didn't move. There was a stillness about her that was almost unnatural, like a deer frozen in place, deciding whether to bolt or stand its ground. Sections. "This is Elena Morales," Henry said, gesturing toward the woman. "She came into town 2 days ago, looking for work. Saw your notice and said she could cook. She doesn't speak much English, but she seems capable." Prutafer. The woman finally turned her head and looked at Thomas. Her eyes met his for just a moment, and in that brief glance he saw weariness and exhaustion, and something harder underneath. A determination that hadn't been broken by whatever had brought her to this place. Paragraph 4. "Can you cook?" Thomas asked, his voice rough from disuse. She didn't answer. Henry cleared his throat. "Like I said, not much English. But she nodded when I asked if she could cook, and she's got references from a family down in El Paso. Lost her position when they moved east. Père voir." Thomas studied her for a long moment. She was thin, almost frail-looking, but there was a straightness to her spine that suggested strength. Her hands, he noticed, were work-worn, the fingers calloused. These were not the hands of someone afraid of labor. "Section's rooms in the back of the house," he said finally. "Meals, 3 times a day. I'll pay $2 a week, plus room and board." Per favor. Henry translated in halting Spanish, and the woman's eyes widened slightly. She nodded once, a quick, decisive movement. Monprarov Henry helped her down from the wagon and unloaded her belongings, a single battered trunk and a cloth bundle tied with string. Thomas carried the trunk into the house and set it in the small room off the kitchen that had once been a pantry. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. A single window looked out toward the creek. Sections she followed him inside, moving carefully, her eyes taking in every detail of the space. When he set the trunk down and stepped back, she remained in the doorway, not entering the room, not claiming it yet. Sections. "It's yours," he said. Door has a latch on the inside. Sections. He didn't know if she understood the words, but she looked at the door, at the simple iron latch, and something in her expression shifted. She nodded again. Sections Henry left after extracting a promise from Thomas to bring the woman back to town if things didn't work out. Thomas stood in the yard and watched the wagon disappear down the road, then turned back to the house. Through the window he could see her moving in the kitchen, unpacking items from her bundle. Parfois. He went back to work in the barn, giving her space to settle in. When he came in at dusk, the house smelled different. The air was filled with the scent of cooking food. Real food, not beans from a tin. His stomach clenched with a hunger he hadn't felt in years. Part row. She was at the stove, stirring something in a large pot. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, white, and her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows. When she heard him enter, she turned, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the dim room. Sections. He gestured toward the table. She nodded and ladled food onto a tin plate, setting it at his usual place, along with a cup of water. Then she served herself a smaller portion and carried it to the far end of the table, as far from him as she could get, while still sitting at the same piece of furniture. Sections. Thomas sat down and looked at the plate. Beans, but not from a tin. These had been cooked with onions and peppers and some kind of meat he didn't recognize. A thick tortilla, warm and soft, wrapped in a cloth. A small pile of rice, each grain separate and perfect. Par before. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The flavor hit his tongue like a revelation, rich and complex and alive in a way that made every meal he'd eaten for the past 3 years taste like sawdust in comparison. He took another bite and another, eating in silence while she watched him from the corner of her eye. When he finished, he set down his fork and looked at her. "Good," he said. "That was good." She didn't smile, but the tension in her shoulders eased slightly. She gathered the plates and carried them to the dry sink, pouring hot water from the kettle and beginning to wash them with the efficiency that spoke of long practice. Sections, he sat at the table and watched her work. This stranger in his house, this woman whose name he could barely pronounce. She moved with a quiet grace, her hands quick and sure. When she finished washing the dishes, she wiped down the counter and the stovetop, then folded the cloth and hung it on a nail by the sink. Paige. She turned to him, and he realized she was waiting for permission to leave, to retreat to her room. He nodded, and she disappeared through the doorway, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Thomas sat alone in the kitchen, the house still smelling of her cooking, and felt something shift in his chest. A small crack in the wall he'd built around himself, so slight he almost didn't notice it. The next morning she was up before him, which was a feat he hadn't thought possible. When he emerged from his room in the gray pre-dawn light, she was already at the stove, and the smell of coffee filled the air. Real coffee, brewed properly, strong and rich, and nothing like the bitter sludge he'd been forcing down for years, and Sections. She set a cup on the table for him without a word, then returned to the stove. He drank the coffee and watched her work. She moved around the kitchen like she'd been there for years, finding things, organizing things, making the space her own through small, quiet actions. Sections. Breakfast was eggs. He didn't know how she'd gotten eggs, but there they were, scrambled with peppers and onions and folded into a warm tortilla. He ate standing up, the way he always did, but this time he ate slowly, tasting every bite. When he finished, he set the plate on the counter and headed for the door. He paused with his hand on the latch and looked back at her. She was washing the pan, her back to him, her movements steady and calm. "Perpetuer, thank you," he said. Or... She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the words, but her hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. Sections. He spent the day riding the fence line on the north pasture, checking for breaks and weak posts. It was solitary work, the kind he'd always preferred, but today his mind kept drifting back to the house, to the woman working in his kitchen, to the way the space had felt different when he left that morning. Warmer, somehow. More alive. For when he returned at midday, she had food waiting. A stew of some kind, thick with vegetables and meat, served with fresh tortillas and a small bowl of salsa that burned his mouth in the best possible way. He ate at the table, and she ate standing at the counter, still maintaining that careful distance. Barbitro. He wanted to say something, to ask her questions, where she'd come from, what had brought her here, why she'd taken a job this far from town. But the words wouldn't come, and the silence stretched between them like a physical thing. Sections after the meal, he went back to work, and when he came in at dusk, the third meal was waiting. This time it was chicken. He had no idea where she'd gotten chicken, cooked in a sauce made with tomatoes and chilies and spices he couldn't name. The rice was studded with peas and carrots, and there was a small stack of tortillas wrapped in cloth to keep them warm. He sat down at the table, and she served him, then took her own plate to the counter. He picked up his fork and took the first bite, and the flavor exploded across his tongue. Complex and layered, and so far beyond anything he'd expected that he actually stopped chewing for a moment, just holding the food in his mouth, letting the taste settle into every corner of his awareness. Sections. He took another bite and another, eating slowly now, paying attention to every flavor, every texture. The chicken was tender, falling apart at the touch of his fork. The sauce was rich and slightly sweet, with an underlying heat that built gradually. The rice was perfect, each grain distinct. The tortillas were warm and soft, with a faint taste of corn and smoke. But he was halfway through the meal when he realized what was happening. This wasn't just food. This was care. This was someone taking raw ingredients and transforming them into something that nourished not just the body, but something deeper. Something he'd thought had died 3 years ago, on a cold February morning when he'd buried his wife and child on the hill behind the house. And sections. He set down his fork and looked at her. She was eating her own meal, her eyes downcast, her movements small and precise. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his attention, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the awareness that he was watching her. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked. Perhaps she looked up, startled by the question. She didn't answer, couldn't answer, he realized, because she didn't understand the words. But she held his gaze for a moment longer than she had before, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tighten. Fuertar. He finished the meal in silence, and when he was done, he carried his plate to the dry sink himself instead of leaving it on the table. She watched him, surprise flickering across her face. He set the plate down and turned to her. "Worry sections. That was the best meal I've had in 3 years," he said. "Maybe the best meal I've ever had." Sections. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. A small smile touched the corners of her mouth, so brief he almost missed it, and then it was gone. Parn. He went to bed that night with his stomach full and his mind churning. He lay in the darkness and listened to the silence of the house, but it was a different silence now, not empty but full, charged with the presence of another human being, breathing and moving and existing in the space beyond his door. By the third meal, he knew he was done. Done with the loneliness that had wrapped around him like a shroud. Done with the empty house and the silent evenings and the slow march toward becoming something less than human. Done with pretending that he could live this way forever. That survival was the same thing as living. She had cracked something open in him, and he didn't know how to close it again. Didn't want to close it again. Over the next few days, he began to notice other changes. The kitchen was cleaner than it had been in years, the surfaces scrubbed, the shelves organized. She'd found the broom and swept the floors, removing years of accumulated dust and dirt. She'd washed the windows, letting more light into the main room. Small things, quiet things, but they added up to a transformation. Por favor. She'd also started a garden. He came around the side of the house one afternoon and found her on her knees in the dirt, working the soil with her bare hands. Maybe she'd chosen a spot near the back wall where the morning sun would hit, but the afternoon shade would provide relief from the worst of the heat. She'd already planted something. He could see the small green shoots emerging from the dark earth. For a while he stood and watched her work, the way her hands moved through the soil with a sureness that spoke of deep knowledge. She was humming something under her breath, a melody he didn't recognize, soft and rhythmic and strangely beautiful. Poor. She looked up and saw him standing there. The humming stopped, and she sat back on her heels, waiting. "Portefuro, what did you plant?" he asked. She gestured to the shoots, then mimed eating, then pointed to the kitchen. Herbs, he realized. She was planting herbs for cooking. Proud. He nodded and walked away, but the image of her kneeling in the dirt and her hands dark with soil stayed with him for the rest of the day. 4. That evening, after the meal, another extraordinary meal, this time featuring fish she'd somehow acquired from a passing trader, He brought out a wooden crate from the barn and set it on the kitchen floor. Inside were tools he hadn't used in years: a spade, a hoe, a small cultivator. He pushed the crate toward her with his boot. "Parbar, for the garden," he said. "Parbar." She looked at the tools, then at him, and this time the smile that touched her face lasted long enough for him to see it clearly. She knelt beside the crate and ran her fingers over the wooden handles, testing the weight of each tool, and he saw something in her expression that he recognized: the look of someone being given not just objects, but possibility. Sections. The days began to develop a rhythm. He would wake to the smell of coffee and breakfast. He would work the ranch, riding out to check the herd or mend fences or clear brush from the creek bed. He would return at midday to find food waiting, and again at dusk. And each meal was a revelation, each one different from the last, each one prepared with a care and skill that spoke of something more than mere duty. Sections. She began to move through the house with more confidence, no longer hugging the walls or jumping at sudden sounds. She claimed space, made decisions, rearranged things to suit her workflow. And he let her, because every change she made brought more life into the place, more warmth. For one evening, he came in to find her standing at the table with a small carved figure in her hands. It was a bird, a hawk rendered in smooth dark wood with wings spread in flight. She'd been working on it in her room, he realized, carving it with a small knife during the hours between meals. She set it on the shelf above the stove, positioning it carefully so it seemed to be flying toward the window. Then she stepped back and looked at it, and he saw satisfaction in her face. Fall. It was the first beautiful thing the house had held in 3 years. 2 weeks after her arrival, he was working in the barn when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He walked out into the yard and saw 3 riders coming up the road from town. He recognized them immediately: Clayton Wade and 2 of his ranch hands. Parahorn Wade was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a red face and pale eyes that held a meanness he didn't bother to hide. He owned the largest spread in the valley, and he treated his workers like property and his neighbors like obstacles to be removed. Sections. The 3 men pulled up in front of the house, and Wade swung down from his saddle with the heaviness of someone used to taking up space. "Pargafar Brennan," he said, his voice loud in the quiet afternoon. "Heard you got yourself some help." Pipes Thomas stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his face expressionless. "Hired a cook," he said. "That's all." Papi Wade grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "That's so. Word is she's a Mexican. That true?" Pirvar. Thomas didn't answer. Wade took a step closer, and his men fanned out slightly, a casual movement that put them in position to flank. "Now I don't care what a man does on his own property," Wade said. "But some folks in town are saying it ain't right, having one of them living out here with a white man, unmarried, alone. You understand what I'm saying? Sections." "No," Thomas said flatly. "I don't. Sections." Wade's grin faded. "I'm saying it don't look good. I'm saying you might want to reconsider your arrangement. Send her back to town. Find yourself a proper woman to do your cooking." Three Peror. "She's my employee," Thomas said. "What she is or isn't beyond that is none of your concern." Furor's Wade's face darkened. "Everything that happens in this valley is my concern, Brennan. You'd do well to remember that." Paragraphor. The door to the house opened, and Elena stepped out onto the porch. She didn't say anything, and didn't move beyond the threshold, but her presence changed the entire dynamic. Wade turned to look at her, and his expression shifted into something ugly. Paragraphor. Well now, he said. There she is. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Barbara. Thomas moved without thinking, stepping between Wade and the porch, his body a wall. You're done here, he said, his voice low and hard. Get off my land. Paragraph 4. Wade stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could see the calculation in his eyes, weighing the cost of pushing this further, measuring the risk. Finally, Wade spat in the dust and turned back to his horse. Part 4. This ain't over, he said, swinging back into the saddle. You're making a mistake, Brennan, and mistakes have consequences. But the three men rode off, and Thomas stood in the yard until they disappeared over the ridge. Then he turned back to the house. Elena was still standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself, her face pale. He climbed the steps and stopped a few feet from her. You okay? He asked. She looked at him, and he saw fear in her eyes, but also something else. A question, a need to understand what had just happened and what it meant. Sections. They won't come back, he said, though he wasn't sure if that was true. And if they do, they'll have to go through me. She studied his face for a long moment, and then she nodded once, a small, decisive movement. She turned and went back inside, and he followed, closing the door behind them. Par. That night, after the evening meal, they sat at the table in the lamplight. She was grinding herbs in a small stone mortar, and he was mending a bridle, their hands busy with familiar work. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was full, charged with things that didn't need to be said. She looked up from her work and met his eyes. Thomas, she said, and the sound of his name in her voice, accented and careful, hit him like a physical blow. Sections. He set down the bridle, his full attention on her now. Sections. She gestured to herself. Elena, she said, then she pointed to him. Thomas. Sections. It was such a simple thing, this exchange of names, but it felt monumental. He nodded. Elena, he repeated, trying to match her pronunciation. Perot. A small smile touched her lips. See, she said. Elena, Perot. They sat there in the lamplight, looking at each other across the table, and something shifted between them. A recognition, an acknowledgement that they were no longer employer and employee, stranger and stranger, but two people who had begun to matter to each other. Pietro. Over the following days, she began to speak more. Single words at first: water, bread, horse, thank you. Then short phrases, carefully constructed, her accent thick but her meaning clear. He found himself talking to her while he worked, explaining what he was doing, even though he knew she understood maybe one word in 5. But she listened, and she watched, and slowly the language barrier began to erode. Sections one afternoon, he came in from the fields to find her sitting on the porch steps, her face turned up to the sun, her eyes closed. She looked peaceful, almost content, and he realized he'd never seen her look that way before. He sat down on the step below her, leaving space between them, and they sat together in comfortable silence. But after a while, she spoke. My husband, she said, her voice soft and halting, he gone, 2 years. Palapratur. Thomas looked at her, and she met his gaze. Her eyes were dry, but he could see the old grief there, worn smooth by time, but never fully healed. Pafor. My wife, he said, in his voice, a low rumble. 3 years, her and the baby both. Pro. Understanding passed between them, a recognition of shared loss, shared survival. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder, just for a moment, and the touch was light, but it burned through his shirt like a brand. Por lo siento, she whispered. I am sorry, Portai, me too, he said. Portat. They sat together on the porch steps as the sun moved across the sky. Two people who had lost everything and were slowly, carefully, building something new from the wreckage. Perchoir. But Clayton Wade hadn't forgotten. 3 weeks after his first visit, he came back, and this time he brought the sheriff. Biarbiabber Thomas was shoeing a horse in the barn when he heard the riders approach. He set down the horse's hoof and walked out into the yard, wiping his hands on his trousers. Ned Wade sat his horse like a king, and beside him was Sheriff Porter, a tired-looking man in his 50s who wore his badge like a burden. Parforth Brennan, Porter said, his voice weary. We need to talk. About what? Thomas asked. Wade leaned forward in his saddle. About the fact that you're harboring an illegal, he said. She's got no papers, no right to be in this country. Sheriff's here to remove her. Sections. Thomas looked at Porter. That true? Sections. Porter sighed. Wade filed a complaint. Says she's undocumented. I've got to investigate. Peshor. She's my employee, Thomas said. She's got a right to work. Not without papers, Wade said, his voice smug. And I'm betting she doesn't have any. Do you, Brennan? You seen any papers? Peakraf Wharf. Thomas hadn't. He'd never asked and she'd never offered. But he knew what this was. Wade using the law as a weapon, turning bureaucracy into a tool of cruelty. Sections. The door to the house opened, and Elena stepped out. She took one look at the men on horseback, and her face went pale. She said something in Spanish, too fast for Thomas to catch, but he heard the fear in her voice. Barbara Wade smiled. There she is. Sheriff, do your duty, Prar. Porter dismounted slowly, reluctantly. Ma'am, he said, his voice gentle. I need to ask you some questions. Do you have documentation? Papers showing you have a right to be here? Sections. Elena looked at Thomas, her eyes wide with panic. He stepped forward, placing himself between her and the sheriff. Sections. She's not going anywhere, he said. Sections, Wade laughed. You planning to fight the law, Brennan? That's a losing game. Prar. Thomas ignored him, his eyes on Porter. What happens if she doesn't have papers? Sections. Porter rubbed his face. She'd have to come back to town. There'd be a hearing. Likely she'd be deported. Sections. Elena understood enough of that to know what it meant. She made a small sound, almost a whimper, and Thomas felt something break inside his chest. Par, she's my wife, he said. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Wade's smile vanished. Porter stopped moving. Elena stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Pefror, what? Wade demanded. Pefror? She's my wife, Thomas repeated, his voice stronger now. We were married 3 weeks ago. Private ceremony. That makes her a legal resident. Porter looked skeptical. You got a marriage certificate? Sections. Not yet, Thomas said. Haven't had a chance to file the paperwork. But you can ask her yourself. Elena, he said, turning to her. Tell them you're my wife. She looked at him, and he saw understanding dawn in her eyes. She saw what he was doing, the lie he was telling to protect her, and she had to decide in that moment whether to trust him. Tapsi, she said, her voice clear and steady. I am his wife. Viper Wade's face turned purple. That's a damn lie, he sputtered. They're not married. She's been here less than a month. Porter held up a hand. Now, Clayton, I can't prove they're not married, and if Brennan says they are, that's his word against yours. His word? Wade shouted. He's lying to protect her. Sections, Nebel. Maybe so, Porter said. But unless you got proof otherwise, there's nothing I can do. He turned to Thomas. You better get that paperwork filed, Brennan. Soon. Sections I will, Thomas said. Sections. Porter mounted his horse and looked down at Wade. We're done here, Clayton. Let's go. Before Wade stared at Thomas with pure hatred in his eyes. This ain't over, he said. Not by a long shot. The two men rode away, and Thomas stood in the yard until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Elena. She was still standing on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a mixture of relief and confusion, and something else he couldn't quite read. Balaturo. He climbed the steps and stopped in front of her. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't have a choice. Balaturo. She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. Wife? She asked. Papadiapabiator. Just words, he said. To keep you safe. You understand? Just words, Papafertibia. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The words had weight. The words had power. And once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. Porter. She reached out and took his hand, yet her fingers small and warm against his calloused palm. Not just words, she said softly. You save me. Poti. He looked down at their joined hands, and something in his chest cracked wide open. All the walls he'd built, all the defenses he'd erected against feeling anything ever again, came crashing down in that moment. Fartre Elena, he said, and his voice was rough with emotion he couldn't name. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and placed her free hand against his chest, over his heart. I stay, she said. If you want, I stay. Perfect, I want, he said. God help me, I want. She rose up on her toes and pressed her forehead against his, and they stood like that on the porch in the afternoon sunlight, two broken people holding each other up, two lost souls who had somehow found their way home. Patro, that night, after the evening meal, he took her to the hill behind the house. The two wooden crosses stood stark against the darkening sky, and he stood before them with his hat in his hands. Parber 4. This is Mary, he said, his voice low. And this is our daughter, Sarah. They died 3 years ago. Fever took them both in a week. Parfortre's Elena stood beside him, her hand finding his. Lo siento, she whispered. Parforti, he turned to her. I thought I was done, he said. Thought I'd never feel anything again. And then you showed up, and you cooked me a meal, and everything changed. Por favor. She looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes. My husband, she said. He was good man, like you. But he gone, and I alone, and I think maybe I die alone. But you give me home. You give me life. Proper. He pulled her into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his chest. They stood there on the hill as the stars came out, holding each other, grieving together for what they'd lost, and celebrating quietly what they'd found. Sections. The next morning, they rode into town together. Thomas helped her down from the wagon in front of the church, and they walked inside to find the preacher. The ceremony was brief and simple, with Henry Caldwell and his wife standing as witnesses. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed her gently, and she smiled against his lips. Sections. They filed the paperwork at the courthouse, and the clerk stamped it with a heavy thud that made it official, legal, real. Mrs. Elena Brennan, the paper read, and she traced the letters with her finger, her face glowing with something that looked like joy. Sections Wade was in the saloon when they walked past. Warren, he came out onto the boardwalk, his face twisted with rage. You think this changes anything? He shouted. You think I'm going to let this stand? Parapuam. Thomas stopped and turned to face him. It's done, he said calmly. She's my wife, legal and proper. You've got no claim here. Sections Wade took a step forward, his fists clenched. and several men emerged from the saloon behind him, drawn by the promise of violence. But Thomas didn't move, or didn't flinch, and Elena stood beside him, her chin raised, her eyes defiant. Sections Sheriff Porter appeared from the direction of his office, his hand resting on his gun belt. "That's enough, Clayton," he said. "They're married. It's legal. Let it go." Sections. Wade looked around at the growing crowd, at the faces watching from windows and doorways, and he must have seen that public opinion was shifting. Only a few of the townswomen were smiling at Elena, and one of them, the preacher's wife, actually waved. "Power. This ain't over," Wade said, but his voice had lost its conviction. "Power, yes it is," Thomas said, and then he took Elena's hand and walked away, leaving Wade standing alone on the boardwalk, impotent and defeated. Power. They rode back to the ranch in the golden afternoon light, and when they crested the ridge and saw the house in the valley below, Elena squeezed his hand. "Home," she said, and the word had never sounded sweeter. But the months that followed were the happiest of Thomas's life. Elena transformed the ranch from a place of survival into a home. Her garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables and herbs that she used to create meals that became legendary among the few neighbors who visited. She learned English quickly, and he learned bits of Spanish, and they developed a language all their own, built from words and gestures and shared understanding. Sections she sang while she worked, filling the house with music. She carved small, beautiful things and placed them around the rooms. She laughed, a sound he'd never thought he'd hear in that house again, and the sound of it healed something in him that had been broken for so long he'd forgotten what wholeness felt like. And he loved her. It wasn't the wild, passionate love of his youth, but something deeper and stronger, a love built on respect and partnership, and the simple, profound joy of sharing a life with someone who saw him and valued him and chose him every single day. For one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and red, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Frère, you know what I think?" she said, her English now fluid and confident. "Frère, what?" he asked. "Frère. I think maybe we both needed to lose everything," she said, "so we could find each other." "Frère." He put his arm around her and pulled her close. "Maybe so," he said. "Bar." They sat together as the light faded and the stars emerged. Two people who had been broken and lost and alone, now whole and found and together. And in the distance, from the garden she'd planted and nurtured into life, came the sweet scent of herbs and flowers, the smell of growing things, the perfume of hope. Bar, thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes the most profound connections come from the simplest acts of kindness, a meal prepared with care, a hand extended in protection, a heart opened to the possibility of healing. If this story touched you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment where everything changed over something as simple as a shared meal? I'll see you in the next one.